On a cold winter morning in the small town of Maple Hollow, the courtroom doors slowly opened and every breath seemed to stop. A German shepherd walked in first, carrying a worn folder in his jaws, followed by a little girl on crutches, her small eyes burning with quiet courage. They weren't there to beg for mercy, but to prove that the veteran accused of violence was never the villain, because sometimes the real monsters are the ones hiding behind money and power. If you believe that courage doesn't always roar, but sometimes limps in beside a loyal dog, stay with us and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the stories of hope and the silent heroes who still walk among us. Have a peaceful and blessed day. The first light of winter crept slowly over Maple Hollow, painting the quiet town in shades of silver and pale blue. Frost hung thick in the air, and every breath rose like smoke. On the edge of town stood a small wooden house with a chimney trailing thin ribbons of warmth into the cold. Inside, Jack Carter stirred his coffee. A quiet man of 42, with the calm strength of a soldier who had seen too much and now chose peace over noise. Behind him came the soft tap of a metal crutch. Emily, his 5-year-old daughter, moved carefully across the floor, balancing with her polished metal prosthetic, the robot leg she wore with pride. Jack's smile came easily when he looked at her, lined with the gentle ache of a man who had learned to find hope in small things. By the door, Rex waited, a 6-year-old German shepherd, black saddle and tan fur gleaming in the morning light. Once Jack's K9 partner, he had traded duty for quiet mountain life, but never lost his alertness. When Jack opened the door, Rex trotted into the snow, leaving neat paw prints along the porch. Jack helped Emily into their battered pickup truck, folding her crutch beside her, and started the reluctant engine. Together, the three drove down the frosted road toward town, toward the schoolhouse that stood beside the square, through the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and where kindness and suspicion often lived side by side. When they reached the town square, the quiet was broken by the hum of engines. Black SUVs lined along the curb, their windows tinted, their exhaust rising in steady plumes. Jack slowed the truck instinctively. He recognized the emblem on one of the vehicles, the golden crest of the Harlow Foundation. Richard Harlow, the philanthropist of Maple Hollow, had come to town again. The man was in his 50s, tall, with silver hair combed to precision and a smile crafted for the cameras. To most, he was a savior, funding schools, hospitals, and shelters. To Jack, he was a stranger who smiled too easily. Harlow's convoy stopped in front of the City Hall steps. Reporters and assistants hurried around him like shadows. As he stepped out, his polished shoes hit the slush with a soft thud. He wore a dark overcoat, gloves, and that same perfect grin that seemed to never reach his eyes. Emily leaned closer to the window. "Is he famous, Daddy?" she whispered. Jack nodded slowly. "Something like that." He parked the truck and opened the door, letting Rex out to stretch. The dog's posture shifted almost immediately. His ears shot up, his muscles tensed, and a low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Jack frowned, reaching for the leash. "Easy, boy." But Rex wasn't responding to the tone. His gaze was locked on Harlow. The man was only a few steps away, shaking hands with the mayor, laughing for the press. Rex's growl deepened. Then, in one swift movement, he lunged forward. The leash slipped from Jack's glove. Snow sprang as the dog bounded across the square. The moment froze like a photograph. Harlow turned, startled, his polished composure cracking. Rex reached him in seconds, not at his throat, not at his hand, but at the lower side of his coat. His teeth sank into the pocket, fabric tearing with a sharp rip. Papers fluttered to the ground. "Get it off me!" Harlow shouted, voice breaking into a higher pitch that drew every eye in the square. Jack ran forward, heart pounding, grabbing Rex's collar and pulling hard. "Off, Rex, off!" The dog obeyed, snapping back, eyes still fixed on Harlow. The entire square erupted into noise. Gasps, camera clicks, shouts. 2 uniformed officers rushed over. "Sir, control your animal!" one barked. Harlow stumbled backward, panting, clutching the torn edge of his coat. His assistants surrounded him immediately, voices rising in rehearsed outrage. He attacked unprovoked. "That dog's dangerous!" Cell phones were already up, recording every second. Jack knelt beside Rex, who was now silent, steady, his gaze still cold and unwavering. The leash was back in Jack's grip, but the damage, at least to appearances, was done. By the afternoon, the video had already spread online. The headline read, "Disabled Veterans Dog Attacks Local Philanthropist." Reporters waited outside the sheriff's office. Rex was taken into custody for behavioral assessment, and Jack was issued a formal notice of civil investigation for public endangerment. The words stung more than they should have. At home that evening, the house felt smaller, colder. Emily sat on the couch with her crutch beside her, eyes red. "They think Rex is bad," she said softly. Jack knelt beside her, brushing her hair back. "He's not bad, sweetheart. He's trying to tell us something." When Emily fell asleep, Jack sat at the kitchen table, the silence pressing against him like weight. He replayed the morning again and again, the way Rex's body had moved, not wild, not random, but deliberate, focused. He remembered the exact spot where the dog had bitten, the left pocket of Harlow's coat. On instinct, he reached into his jacket where he'd stuffed the torn scrap of fabric earlier, and something slipped out, a small folded piece of paper, stained and creased. It must have been ripped free when Rex tore the pocket. Jack unfolded it carefully. Inside were a few short lines of printed symbols and numbers, coordinates perhaps, arranged like code. His brow furrowed. He didn't understand it, but something in his gut tightened, the same instinct that once kept him alive in places where hesitation could mean death. He looked at the sleeping figure of his daughter in the next room, then at the empty space near the door where Rex used to rest every night. The sound of the wind outside howled through the trees like a whisper he couldn't ignore. The next morning, before the sun broke through the frost, Jack sat in his truck again, the scrap of paper on the dashboard. He traced the coordinates with his finger, memorizing them. Somewhere inside him, the old soldier stirred, the one who trusted instincts, patterns, and loyalty over appearances. Rex hadn't attacked out of anger. He'd reacted to something real, something hidden. Jack didn't yet know what it was, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His dog wasn't wrong. Something about Richard Harlow didn't smell right. The snow along Silver Ridge crunched under Jack Carter's boots as he stepped out of his truck. The drive had taken him far beyond the last lights of Maple Hollow, into the kind of quiet that felt older than sound itself. The air was sharp enough to sting his lungs, and the sky hung low and colorless. Ahead stood the warehouse, a hulking skeleton of rusted steel and cracked concrete, its sign half fallen, its windows blind with frost. The coordinates had led him straight here. He swept his flashlight across the yard and stopped. Fresh tire tracks carved through the snow, wide and heavy, too recent for an abandoned site. Someone had been here, and not long ago. Jack followed the marks toward a side door that hung crooked on its hinges. The wind groaned through the seams as he pushed it open, the metal shrieking in protest. Inside, darkness seemed thicker than the cold itself. His flashlight beam skimmed across the floor, old oil stains, broken pallets, and a line of heavy footprints disappearing into the far end of the room. The silence felt alive, broken only by the steady tick of melting ice dripping from the rafters. Then, at the far corner, he saw something that made his stomach tighten, chains bolted to a support beam, their ends frayed but polished clean from recent use. He moved closer, crouching to examine the ground beneath. There were scuff marks, small and uneven, the drag of shoes, the faint dent of knees pressed against concrete. Someone had struggled here. Just beyond the beam, a small plastic tag half buried in dust read Harlow Foundation, Medical Supplies. Jack's pulse quickened. He turned toward a low table by the wall where a flashlight, newer, military grade, lay abandoned. It was still faintly warm to the touch. Whoever had used it hadn't been gone for more than a day. As he turned to leave, something delicate caught his light. A scrap of purple fabric hung from a nail near the door, swaying gently in the draft. He lifted it carefully, soft, finely woven, perfumed faintly with lavender, too gentle a scent for a place that smelled of rust and fear. Along one edge, embroidered in silver thread, were two small letters. LJ. Jack frowned. He knew that name. Months ago, a missing person flyer had hung on the bulletin board of the diner. Laura Jennings, 29. Last seen leaving her job at the Harlow Charitable Trust. A kind smile in the photo, gone without a trace. The local news said she'd moved out of state. Her sister said otherwise. The discovery sat heavy in his palm as he walked back to his truck. He sealed the fabric in a small evidence pouch he still kept from his service days and took one last look at the warehouse. Snow was falling again, soft and soundless, covering the tire tracks as if the night itself wanted to erase what he'd seen. But the smell of lavender lingered in the air, a scent out of place, impossible to forget. Jack started the engine and headed back toward town. At dawn, he spread the evidence across his kitchen table, the map, the fabric, a photo of the tag from the warehouse. The heater hummed weakly, but the chill wouldn't leave him. He needed someone who could see through the layers of legal armor surrounding men like Harlow. Grace Holloway's name came to mind immediately. She'd helped veterans like him navigate red tape and survive systems designed to break them twice. He called her, and her voice, calm, deliberate, with a quiet strength, answered before the second ring. Grace arrived by noon, snow clinging to the hem of her charcoal coat. She was in her 30s, tall, confident, with skin the color of warm coffee and eyes that carried both warmth and warning. A faint scar traced the side of her jaw, half hidden by her hair, a relic from a past she never talked about. She listened while Jack explained everything. Rex's outburst, Harlow's performance at the square, the coordinates, the warehouse, and the piece of fabric. When he handed her the pouch, she studied it in silence. "Laura Jennings," she said at last. "She filed an ethics complaint against Harlow's trust 6 months before she vanished. The file was sealed before anyone could read it." Grace set her briefcase on the table and flipped it open to reveal a thin folder. Inside were old press clippings, financial ledgers, and copies of offshore transaction logs. "I've been following him for years," she admitted. "Harlow launders money through shell charities, orphan relief, refugee aid, disaster funds, but the trail ends in freight contracts and ghost employees. That warehouse of yours? It's not storage, it's transfer." Jack felt a slow, cold weight settle in his stomach. For the first time, the fragments began to connect. Meanwhile, at the county kennel, Emily stood on tiptoe to peer through the chain-link fence. Snowflakes clung to her hair as she whispered, "Hi, Rex." The dog lifted his head immediately, tail thumping weakly against the floor. She slid a folded blue scarf through the bars, one that carried the faint scent of her shampoo. "So you won't forget me," she said. Deputy Daniel Hayes, the young officer assigned to the facility, watched from the hallway. He was about 38, tall and steady built, his uniform creased with precision, but his eyes kind. "He's calmer when you visit," he said softly, and when no one was looking, he took the scarf and slipped it inside Rex's pen. That afternoon, Jack took his findings to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Donnelly, gray-haired, heavy-set, and weary from decades of small-town compromise, looked up from his paperwork as Jack entered. "We need to talk," Jack said, placing the photos and evidence pouch on the desk. Donnelly scanned the materials with a long exhale. "Jack," he began, "you're treading on dangerous ground. Harlow funds half the emergency services in this county. You think anyone wants to accuse him of crimes without proof that sticks?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Then take it. Make it stick." The sheriff hesitated, then slowly pushed the folder back. "I can't." Jack walked out into the bitter air, the rejection heavier than the cold. He drove home in silence, the folder lying unopened on the passenger seat. The headlines on the radio praised Harlow's new hospital donation, another spotless act in a dirty play. When he reached his driveway, the decision was already made. He called Grace and told her everything. There was a pause, then her steady voice. "If the law won't hear you, Jack, we'll make it listen. We take this to court. Let justice hear the truth for once." That night, as wind howled across the ridge, Jack sat by Emily's door watching her sleep. Her small frame rose and fell beneath the blanket, her crutch leaning against the wall. The scent of lavender drifted faintly from the fabric on his desk, the same scent Rex had risked everything to reveal. Somewhere inside the storm, truth was waiting. And now, with Grace by his side and a courtroom as their battlefield, Jack knew they were finally ready to bring it into the light. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes that morning, blanketing Maple Hollow in a silence too heavy to feel peaceful. 3 days had passed since Grace vowed to bring the truth to light, and the storm had not stopped since. The courthouse, an old stone building at the center of town, loomed beneath gray skies, its flag stiff in the wind. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. Richard Harlow had filed a civil suit against Jack Carter for defamation and unprovoked endangerment, demanding a public apology, financial compensation, and the immediate destruction of what he called a dangerous animal. Reporters crowded the steps, their cameras ready. For most of Maple Hollow, it was not just a hearing, it was a spectacle. Jack arrived early, dressed in a suit that had seen better years. It was one he had worn at his military discharge hearing long ago, and though it hung loosely now, he wore it with quiet dignity. His face was tired, but steady, his eyes clear. Grace walked beside him, her dark coat whipping in the wind, a calm pillar amid the noise. In the cage of the county kennel miles away, Rex remained under isolation, monitored around the clock by order of the court. His food was untouched, his eyes fixed on the door as if waiting for a command that never came. When the session began, the courtroom filled to capacity. Locals squeezed into benches, journalists lined the aisles, and even the mayor appeared in the back row, whispering to Harlow's aides. Harlow himself sat at the plaintiff's table, immaculate as always. His gray suit gleamed, his hair combed to perfection, his every gesture measured. He played his role with practiced ease, the wounded benefactor, betrayed by a reckless soldier, and his beast. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Helms with sharp features and a tone that tolerated no theatrics, adjusted her glasses and called for order. Harlow's attorney, a stocky man named Leonard Doyle, wasted no time. His voice boomed through the chamber, rehearsed and cutting. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what we have here is a tragedy born of negligence. A trained ex-military dog unleashed upon a respected citizen. My client, Mr. Harlow, was attacked without provocation. He seeks not revenge, but justice." The audience murmured. Doyle turned toward Jack. A man entrusted with discipline, yet unable to control his own animal. Grace's pen tapped once against her pad before she rose. Her voice was calm, even soft, but it carried weight. "Your Honor," she said, "before we let this performance continue, I request to enter new evidence into the record. A traffic camera video taken at the Maple Hollow Square the morning of the incident." The judge gestured for her to proceed. Grace connected her laptop to the courtroom monitor, the screen flickering to life. The video played silently. The crowd watched the familiar scene. Harlow stepping out of his SUV, Rex lunging forward, Jack pulling him back. But Grace slowed the footage. "Frame 37, she said. The moment froze. Harlow's hand was halfway inside his coat pocket. "Frame 38. The hand emerged holding something small, reflective. "Frame 39, she continued. Rex reacts." The room held its breath. Grace turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this moment occurs 1/10 of a second before the dog's movement. My client's K9 was not acting without cause. He was alerting, exactly as he was trained to do." Harlow's attorney stood. "Objection. Speculation." Grace faced him, unflinching. "Then let the evidence speak. I motion to have the coat in question sealed and examined by a forensic team for residues or concealed items." Judge Helms leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Harlow. "Mr. Harlow, do you still possess that coat?" For the first time, his polished calm flickered. "It's been sent for cleaning," he replied. "Convenient," the judge said dryly. "Motion granted. The coat will be subpoenaed for forensic analysis." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Grace turned to Jack, her eyes steady. "We just bought time," she whispered. 3 days to find what he's hiding." Outside, the storm raged harder. By evening, Grace's car crawled through the snow back to Jack's cabin, where the two mapped their next steps. Harlow's team would try to delay the investigation or bury the coat in bureaucracy. Grace planned to build an unshakable case before they could move. Jack nodded quietly. "Then we don't waste a second." The following day, Emily sat in the small waiting area of the county station, her crutch leaning against the bench. She looked smaller under the fluorescent lights, her winter hat sliding over one ear. Deputy Hayes approached, holding a cup of cocoa that steamed gently. "Your dad's fighting for him," he said softly. "You should be proud." Emily looked up. "I am," she replied, "but Rex can't talk, so I have to." The words were so simple that Hayes had to look away. Something in his chest tightened. "What do you mean?" She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notebook filled with shaky drawings. Chains, a warehouse, a purple cloth, a man's coat. "Miss Grace said Rex was right," she said, "so we have to help him finish what he started." That night, while the snow piled against the station windows, Hayes unlocked the back corridor to the kennel. The lights flickered softly as Emily hobbled forward on her crutch. Rex lifted his head the moment she appeared. "Hey, boy," she whispered, pressing her hand through the bars. The German shepherd stood, tail low but steady. Hayes hesitated, then opened the gate just wide enough for her to slide the scarf inside and touch his collar. Grace had given Hayes specific instructions: check for foreign particles, trace scents, anything that could connect Harlow's coat to evidence of controlled substances or sedatives. Hayes took a small sample swab from the collar tag, sealed it in a vial, and handed it to Emily. "For Miss Grace," he said quietly. "Now let's get you home before anyone notices." 3 days passed like a held breath. The snowstorm refused to break, coating Maple Hollow in white silence. On the morning of the resumed hearing, the courthouse was packed. Reporters jostled for space, their breath visible in the freezing air. Inside, the wooden benches were filled with townspeople, some curious, some angry, some simply desperate to see truth unfold. At the defense table, Jack adjusted his old tie. Grace sat beside him, calm as ever, her briefcase resting on her lap. Across the aisle, Harlow sat straight-backed and smiling, confident in his inevitability. When Judge Helms entered, the murmur died instantly. Grace stood, file in hand. "Your Honor, before we continue, the defense submits new forensic findings from the collar of the detained K-9 unit, as well as chain of custody documentation verified by Deputy Daniel Hayes." The judge accepted the folder, scanning the summary as the courtroom leaned in. Grace continued, her tone measured but fierce. "The substance found on the collar matches trace chemical compounds used in sedatives, identical to those listed in medical procurement records from the Harlow Foundation warehouse at Silver Ridge." Harlow's attorney stood abruptly. "That's circumstantial." "It's a pattern," Grace said, "and patterns tell stories." Outside, the snow thickened, muffling every sound beyond the courthouse walls. Inside, truth was finally beginning to speak, through documents, through courage, and through the silent bond between a child, a veteran, and a loyal dog waiting for the door to open. And while Harlow sat smiling, certain of his control, he didn't yet realize that justice was already walking toward him, on one metal crutch and 4 steadfast paws. Snow swirled outside the courthouse like ash from a dying fire. Inside, the room was tense, every breath measured, every sound amplified. The hearing had stretched long past noon, and fatigue hung over the benches like a fog. Judge Margaret Helms adjusted her glasses, her gavel resting in her hand as she prepared to deliver the court's interim decision. Grace Holloway sat poised beside Jack, her expression calm but her eyes flickering toward the clock. Harlow's smile had returned, faint but confident, as if he could already hear the words clearing his name. Cameras clicked softly in the back row. Then, just as the judge opened her mouth to speak, the heavy doors of the courtroom burst open. All heads turned. A hush swept through the hall as the echo of metal crutches tapped against the marble floor. Emily Carter stood in the doorway, cheeks flushed from the cold, her small frame steady despite the weight of her prosthetic leg. Behind her, Deputy Hayes guided Rex on a short lead. Snow clung to their boots and fur. Their sudden entrance cut through the courtroom's polished composure like a spark in dry air. The spectators whispered, confused, but Grace's lips curved into the smallest, knowing smile. "Right on time," she murmured. Judge Helms struck the gavel once. "This is a restricted proceeding. Who authorized?" Grace rose quickly. "Your Honor, if I may. The defense moves to enter new evidence delivered under lawful supervision by Officer Daniel Hayes." The deputy stepped forward, his uniform dusted with snow, eyes firm but respectful. "Verified, Your Honor. The material was recovered under direct chain of custody." He gestured toward Rex. The German shepherd moved forward, calm and steady, his black and tan coat gleaming under the courtroom lights. In his jaws he carried a sealed evidence pouch, the The tag marked Silver Ridge Surveillance. The crowd's murmurs swelled into disbelief. Grace took the pouch gently, her voice clear and unwavering. This file contains video footage extracted from a hidden security camera recovered at the Silver Ridge warehouse, the same site identified through evidence presented earlier. She inserted the drive into her laptop, the screen flickering to life once more. The court will want to see this. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Proceed. The lights dimmed slightly as the footage began. Static first, then grainy images of a snow-covered lot, the timestamp only days before the alleged incident at the square. A convoy of black trucks bearing the Harlow Foundation insignia rolled into frame. The video zoomed closer. One of the truck doors opened. Inside, not boxes or supplies, but the outline of people. Figures hunched together in the cold, wrists bound, their breaths visible in the winter air. A faint metallic clang echoed from within the container. Grace paused the video. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "the defense submits that these are human trafficking victims, transported under the cover of humanitarian aid shipments. Each vehicle is registered under the Harlow Trust logistics arm. This footage is timestamped 48 hours before my client's K9 reacted to the scent of controlled substances on Mr. Harlow's coat." The room erupted. Harlow's lawyer leapt to his feet, shouting, "Forgery! Manipulated footage!" But his voice drowned beneath the rising storm of outrage from the gallery. Judge Helms banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom!" Grace stood motionless, waiting for silence to fall. Then, as if timed by fate, an officer entered from the hallway, a sealed envelope in hand. "Your Honor," he said, "the forensic report you requested, expedited from Denver." Helms gestured him forward. The clerk unfolded the document and read aloud. "Trace DNA recovered from the inner pocket of the plaintiff's coat matches the genetic profile of Laura Jennings, missing since last year." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint tap of snowmelt dripping from the window ledge. Harlow's face drained of color, his confident posture collapsing inch by inch. Grace didn't gloat. She simply turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense moves for immediate protective custody orders for any individuals still held under the Harlow Foundation's authority and for a search warrant of all associated properties." Helms nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Motion granted. Sheriff Donnelly, execute without delay." Donnelly, seated in the back row, stood. His heavy frame seemed smaller beneath the weight of realization. For years he had looked away, convincing himself it was politics, not cowardice. Now he met Jack's eyes and gave a single nod, the kind that carried both apology and promise. Within minutes, officers were on their radios, dispatching units toward Harlow's estate at Red Pine Hill. Outside, the snow intensified, the sound of sirens faint beneath the storm. The courtroom remained frozen in disbelief. Harlow sat rigid, his hands trembling slightly on the table. "You can't," he hissed. "You have no idea who I am." Grace's gaze hardened. "We do now." Behind her, Emily stood beside Rex, one hand resting on his back. The dog's ears flicked forward, his eyes fixed on Harlow as if recognizing the scent of truth at last. Reporters had begun scribbling furiously. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of justice finally stirring. Hours later, the town would know. Patrol cars surrounded the sprawling Harlow estate under the blizzard's veil. What they found beneath the mansion's foundation shocked even the most seasoned officers. A hidden basement complex, soundproofed and fortified, holding a dozen captives, some too weak to speak, others clinging to life. Among them was Laura Jennings, frail but breathing, her lavender scarf still tied at her wrist like a forgotten prayer. Donnelly's radio crackled back to the courthouse with the report. The judge listened in silence, then turned to face the room. "Confirm recovery," she ordered. "Proceed with arrest." As Harlow was led away in cuffs, the murmurs grew into something raw, a collective exhale from a town that had forgotten how to breathe. Jack stood motionless, the noise around him fading into nothing but the rhythmic sound of Rex's breathing beside Emily. Grace gathered her files quietly, her composure unbroken, though the corners of her eyes softened when she looked at the child who had walked into the courtroom on a crutch and turned the tide of justice. The snow outside still fell, thick and endless, but for the first time, Maple Hollow felt clean. Morning light spilled across Maple Hollow like the slow turning of a new page. The storm had cleared overnight, leaving the streets coated in a glaze of white, untouched and bright beneath a calm sky. Outside the courthouse, news vans still lined the curb, their antennas pointed toward the building as reporters braced against the cold, waiting for official confirmation. Inside, the echo of the judge's voice still lingered from the night before, the words that sealed the town's fate. Richard Harlow, arrested and charged with human trafficking, falsification of charity documents, and obstruction of justice. For once, the law had found its way through the storm. Jack Carter stood on the courthouse steps, his coat buttoned against the biting wind. He wasn't smiling, but the stiffness that had haunted his face for weeks had softened. Grace Holloway stood beside him, fielding questions from a wall of microphones and cameras. Her tone was professional, but her eyes kept straying to Emily, who stood a few feet away, bundled in her small wool coat, one hand resting on Rex's back. The German shepherd stood proudly, his ears perked, his breath fogging the air in steady puffs. To most, he was just a dog, but to the people gathered that day, he was something more. By noon, every major network had the headlines splashed across its feed. Veterans K9 unmasks billionaire's secret, justice in Maple Hollow. Others were more poetic. Hero dog saves lives, restores honor. The story spread far beyond the town. Jack received phone calls from old comrades, from veterans he'd served with, from strangers who simply wanted to thank him. Grace's firm was flooded with inquiries. Even the governor's office released a statement praising the bravery of those who stood for truth when silence would have been safer. For a man who had lived quietly on the edge of town, it all felt too large, too loud. But Emily's laughter in the background made it bearable. The court's ruling 2 days later carried an unexpected note. Judge Helms, who rarely allowed sentiment in her courtroom, read from a prepared document with careful precision. "It is the judgment of this court," she said, "that the animal known as Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd, formerly a K9 service partner, acted with an instinctive and trained response to an immediate threat. Furthermore, his intervention directly contributed to the uncovering of criminal activity and the preservation of human life." She paused, looking over the room. "Henceforth, this court recognizes Rex as a K9 witness, the first designation of its kind in this state." The room broke into applause before anyone could stop it. Emily clapped until her hands reddened, while Jack bowed his head, eyes glassy with emotion he couldn't put into words. Grace allowed herself a small smile, the kind that came from exhaustion more than victory. The judge's gavel eventually restored order, but the sentiment lingered long after. For once, justice didn't wear a face of vengeance or triumph. It wore the quiet dignity of truth, finally spoken aloud. Weeks passed. The investigation widened beyond Maple Hollow, uncovering a web of falsified charities and offshore accounts tied to Harlow's empire. Grace worked with federal agents to finalize charges, while Jack spent long days helping survivors find shelter and care. Laura Jennings recovered slowly under medical supervision, her strength returning alongside her voice. "He thought no one would notice," she told Jack one afternoon at the hospital, "but someone always does. Sometimes it's not a person, it's a dog." Jack didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded, knowing she was right. By spring, the snow began to melt from the ridge and the air filled again with birdsong. Jack and Grace stood before a small crowd at the opening of a new facility on the outskirts of town. A wooden sign hung above the entrance, "Rex Foundation," for veterans, children, and animals in need. The building itself had once been a lumber warehouse, now transformed into a warm space with sunlight spilling through wide windows. Inside were therapy rooms, kennels for rescued dogs, and workshops for veterans learning to rebuild, not just their skills, but their confidence. Grace spoke briefly, her words simple. "This place exists because courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks on 4 legs or stands on a crutch." Rex had become something of a symbol. Children from nearby schools came to visit, leaving drawings and small thank you notes. One little boy asked if Rex could sign his cast. Emily giggled, dipped Rex's paw in blue paint, and pressed it gently to the plaster. "Now he's famous," she said proudly. Jack watched them from a few steps away, the sun warming his shoulders, and for the first time in years, the ache in his chest eased. Grace approached quietly, handing him a folded newspaper. "Front page again," she said. The headline read, "Heroes Don't Always Shout, The Maple Hollow Story." That evening, after the crowd had gone and the last volunteers had left, Jack locked up the foundation building and found Emily sitting on the porch steps beside Rex. The sunset had turned the sky a deep gold, and the fields shimmered with the last snowmelt. Emily's crutch leaned against the railing, her small notebook open on her lap. "Writing again?" Jack asked gently. She nodded without looking up. "Just finishing something." He sat beside her, his hand resting on Rex's back. The dog sighed softly, content. When she was done, she tore the page out and handed it to him. In careful, uneven handwriting it read, "Good people don't need to shout. They just need to be brave enough to do what's right, like Rex." Jack read it twice, then folded it neatly and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The sun sank lower, and for a long time, none of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peace. As night fell over Maple Hollow, the lights of the new foundation glowed softly in the distance, a beacon for anyone still searching for kindness in a hard world. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from inside, mingling with the rustle of trees. Jack rose, lifted Emily into his arms, and carried her inside. Rex followed close behind, his tail brushing against the doorframe as it closed. Outside, snowflakes began to fall again, light as memory, soft as mercy. In a world that often rewards noise and power, this story reminds us that real strength lives in quiet hearts, in those who act with compassion even when no one is watching. Jack, Emily, and Rex showed that love, courage, and sacrifice can rebuild what fear tries to destroy. Their journey is proof that kindness is never wasted, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us what kindness means to you. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories of hope and humanity. May God bless you and everyone you love.